In the beginning, there is unity. A single faith rises across the Arabian Peninsula, shaped by revelation, community, and the life of Prophet Muhammad. Within a few decades, it expands with extraordinary speed, crossing deserts, rivers, and empires that had stood for centuries. It is not just a religion in formation, it is a civilization in motion. But history rarely preserves unity for long. Because when a guiding figure disappears, what remains is not silence, but interpretation. When Muhammad dies in 632 CE, the Islamic world faces its first defining crisis. Not a crisis of belief, but a crisis of leadership. The question is immediate and unavoidable: who now holds authority over this rapidly expanding community? At first, the answer is shaped through consultation and political agreement. Leadership passes to Abu Bakr, a close companion of Muhammad. After him comes Umar, then Uthman. These early caliphs guide the growing Islamic state through expansion, administration, and consolidation. But beneath the surface of this political structure, a deeper disagreement begins to form, one that will not disappear with time. It is a disagreement not only about governance, but about legitimacy. Because within the Muslim community, a different understanding of leadership exists. A group of followers believes that authority should not be decided through consensus alone. Instead, it should remain within the family of the Prophet. They believe leadership carries a spiritual dimension, something inherited rather than elected. At the center of this belief stands Ali ibn Abi Talib, cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, a figure of early importance, deep trust, and symbolic closeness to the Prophet's inner circle. For those who support him, Ali is not simply a political candidate. He is the rightful continuation of divine guidance through the Prophet's lineage. This belief becomes the foundation of what will later be known as Shia Islam. At this stage, however, there is no formal separation. There are no distinct institutions, only differing interpretations of what leadership means in a world where revelation has ended, but governance must continue. As the Islamic State expands, these tensions do not disappear. They evolve, they deepen, they become tied to questions of justice, authority, and the direction of the community itself. When Ali eventually becomes the fourth caliph, the division is no longer theoretical. It is embedded within political reality. His rule is marked by internal conflict, civil war, and competing claims to legitimacy. The unity of the early community begins to fracture under the weight of expansion and disagreement. And from this fracture, something new begins to form. Not immediately as a single institution, but as a long, unfolding divergence within Islam. On one side, the emerging Sunni tradition emphasizes continuity through communal consensus and established leadership. On the other, the Shia perspective increasingly centers on the idea of divinely guided authority passed through the Prophet's family line. These are not yet separate worlds. They are competing understandings within the same expanding civilization. But history rarely leaves such tensions unresolved. Because as the Islamic world grows outward, across Persia, Syria, Egypt, and beyond, these ideological differences begin to attach themselves to geography, politics, and power. What begins as a question of succession slowly becomes a deeper struggle over identity. And in the centuries that follow, this division will not fade. It will evolve. It will fragment. And within one branch of this evolving tradition, a more focused and radical interpretation of spiritual authority will emerge. One that will eventually shape not just belief, but action. Not just theology, but history. In the mountains of Persia, far from the early centers of Islamic power, a new path will begin to take shape. A path defined by secrecy, survival, and absolute devotion to a hidden line of leadership. And at the center of that path, a man will rise whose influence will reshape the political landscape of an entire region. His name is Hassanai Sabbah, and his story begins where this division deepens into destiny. After the first great division within Islam begins to take shape, the Islamic world does not fracture into chaos. Instead, it expands into competing visions of authority, each building its own political and spiritual systems across vast territories. Among these emerging powers, one of the most unusual and influential is the Fatimid Caliphate. Unlike the Sunni-led Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad, the Fatimids rise from a distinctly Shia lineage. They claim descent from Fatima, the daughter of Prophet Muhammad, and through her, they assert a legitimate spiritual succession that stands apart from the dominant Sunni political order. But the Fatimids are not merely a political rival. They are builders of cities, architects of institutions, and patrons of knowledge on a scale that reshapes the intellectual landscape of the medieval Islamic world. At the heart of their power is Cairo, a city founded in 969 CE as a new capital for a new vision of Islamic governance. Unlike earlier centers of power that grew organically over centuries, Cairo is deliberately constructed as a political and ideological statement. It is designed to reflect Fatimid authority, control, and identity. From its earliest days, Cairo is not just a city, it is a symbol. A statement that legitimacy does not belong exclusively to Baghdad or to the Abbasid Caliphate. It belongs wherever the Fatimid vision extends. Within this system, Ismaili Shia Islam becomes the guiding ideological structure of the state. It is not simply a belief system in the private sense. It is a framework that shapes governance, law, education, and public life. At the center of Fatimid power lies a unique dual structure, the Caliph Imam. This figure is not only a political ruler, but also a spiritual authority. Unlike the Sunni caliphs, whose legitimacy is rooted in community consensus and tradition, the Fatimid Imam Caliph is seen as divinely guided, a continuation of the prophetic line through hidden knowledge and esoteric interpretation. This belief in hidden meaning becomes one of the defining intellectual features of Ismaili thought. The world, in this framework, is not only what it appears to be. It is layered, symbolic, interpretable, and behind every external form lies a deeper truth that only those with proper understanding can access. This philosophical structure allows the Fatimid intellectual world to flourish in unexpected ways. Cairo becomes home to scholars, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers. Institutions such as Al-Azhar emerge not only as religious centers, but also as hubs of learning and discourse. Knowledge is not restricted, it is cultivated. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy develop in parallel with theology. The Fatimid court supports translation movements, scholarly debates, and the preservation of ancient texts. At its height, the Fatimid world represents one of the most intellectually vibrant civilizations of its time. But beneath this surface of stability lies tension. Because the Fatimid system depends on a delicate balance between political authority and spiritual legitimacy, the Imam Caliph is both ruler and interpreter of divine truth. This dual role creates a structure that is powerful but also fragile. Internal disagreements over succession begin to emerge. Questions arise about who holds legitimate authority within the Ismaili line. These disputes are not merely political, they are theological and therefore absolute in their stakes. As the centuries progress, external pressures also begin to increase. The Abbasid Caliphate, though politically weakened, still represents a competing ideological authority. Regional powers rise and fall. The Byzantine Empire presses at the edges. Internal divisions within the Islamic world deepen. And in the background of all this complexity, the Fatimid system begins to experience gradual instability. Not collapse, but tension. A growing sense that the ideological unity that once defined its rise is becoming harder to maintain across generations and territories. It is within this environment that smaller, more localized Ismaili communities begin to take shape outside Egypt. In Persia, far from Cairo, these communities exist under different political conditions. Unlike the centralized Fatimid state, they are surrounded by hostile Sunni rulers, competing dynasties, and shifting alliances. Their survival depends not on empire building, but on adaptation. Secrecy begins to emerge not as philosophy, but as necessity. In these regions, Ismaili thought evolves differently. It becomes more defensive, more structured, more focused on survival under pressure. And it is here, in the fragmented political landscape of Persia, that a figure will eventually emerge who transforms this environment entirely. A man who will take the intellectual foundations of Ismaili thought and turn them into a revolutionary system of political resistance. But before he appears, the conditions must fully form. Because revolutions do not begin with individuals. They begin with pressure, with fragmentation, with systems reaching the limits of their stability. And as the Fatimid intellectual world continues to evolve in Cairo and Ismaili communities in Persia continue to adapt under external threat, these two trajectories move slowly toward divergence. One representing centralized ideological power, the other moving toward decentralization, secrecy, and survival. Between them lies a widening gap. And within that gap, history is preparing for the emergence of the assassins. Across the fractured political landscape of the Islamic world, ideas travel in ways that armies cannot fully control. They move through scholars, merchants, students, and travelers. They pass through cities under surveillance and regions under shifting rule. And in the Persian heartlands, where political authority is fragmented and contested, these ideas take root in unstable ground. It is here that Hassan I Sabbah is born. His early life is not preserved in perfect clarity. Like many figures of the medieval world, his biography is shaped by both history and later interpretation. What is known, however, is enough to trace the formation of a mind that will eventually reshape the political reality of an entire region. Hassan grows up in Persia during a period of tension between competing Islamic powers. The Abbasid Caliphate, though still symbolically dominant, no longer holds absolute control over distant provinces. Regional rulers, military governors, and local dynasties exercise real authority. In this environment, political legitimacy is constantly negotiated, enforced, and challenged. From an early age, Hassan is exposed to religious scholarship. He studies theology, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. His intellectual development is not limited to religious instruction alone. Instead, he encounters a world where knowledge is interconnected, where ideas about governance, cosmology, and divine authority overlap. This intellectual environment is crucial, because Hassan does not emerge simply as a political figure. He emerges as a thinker. At some point in his life, Hassan encounters Ismaili doctrine. The exact moment is not clearly defined in historical records, but its impact on him is profound. Ismaili thought offers a framework that resonates deeply with his intellectual inclinations. The idea that reality has hidden layers, that truth is not always visible on the surface, and that legitimate authority is tied to a concealed line of spiritual leadership. In this worldview, the Imam is not merely a political figure. He is the interpreter of hidden truth, the guide to deeper reality. And obedience to this authority is not just political loyalty, it is spiritual alignment. Hassan becomes convinced that this system represents not only theological truth, but also a more stable form of governance than the fragmented political structures surrounding him. But belief alone is not enough to reshape a world. What distinguishes Hassan is not only conviction, but strategy. He understands that ideas require structure to survive under pressure. And in the world he inhabits, Direct confrontation with established powers is not viable. The Seljuk Empire, which dominates much of Persia at this time, is militarily powerful and politically entrenched. Open rebellion would be quickly suppressed. So Hassan develops a different approach, one based not on armies, but on presence, influence, and strategic positioning. He travels extensively, studying different regions, assessing political vulnerabilities, and building networks of trust and ideological alignment. His journey is not one of conquest in the traditional sense. It is one of preparation. He is not yet building a state. He is identifying where one could exist. Eventually, Hassan's path leads him to Egypt, the center of the Fatimid Caliphate. Cairo represents the institutional heart of Ismaili power. If Hassan is to understand the full structure of the ideology he has embraced, he must engage with its most developed form. However, his time in Cairo does not unfold smoothly. Historical accounts suggest that Hassan's relationship with the Fatimid leadership becomes strained. There are disagreements, possibly political, possibly theological, over succession and authority within the Ismaili system. Whatever the precise cause, the result is clear. Hassan is no longer aligned with the central Fatimid establishment. He is exiled or leaves under contested circumstances, depending on the source. But what matters most is not the break itself. It is what follows. Because Hassan returns to Persia not as a student of Ismailism, but as someone determined to build a new structure for it. One that is not dependent on imperial stability in Cairo. One that can survive in hostile territory. One that can operate independently of large-scale political systems. This is the turning point. Hassan begins to develop a vision that is both ideological and practical. At its core is a simple but powerful principle. In a world dominated by unstable empires and competing powers, survival requires control over key positions rather than control over vast territories. Instead of building a traditional state, Hassan focuses on fortresses, strategic locations in mountainous regions, places that are naturally defensible, difficult to access, easy to control with limited resources. These locations become the foundation of what will later be known as the Nizari Ismaili state. But more importantly, Hassan's vision is not just geographic. It is organizational. He begins to imagine a system built on loyalty, discipline, and ideological commitment. A structure where individuals are not merely subjects of a ruler, but participants in a shared mission defined by absolute adherence to the imam's authority. In this framework, obedience is not passive. It is active, intentional, and total. Hassan understands something crucial about power in his environment. Brute force is not the only form of control. Psychological influence, strategic placement, and ideological unity can produce effects that rival traditional military strength. But for such a system to function, it must be protected from fragmentation. It must be isolated from external disruption. And it must be able to operate in secrecy when necessary. As Hassan begins to gather followers, these principles become increasingly concrete. He does not simply recruit individuals. He selects them. He evaluates their commitment, their discipline, and their willingness to operate within a highly structured ideological system. What begins to form is not yet a visible political state. It is something more subtle. A network, a hidden structure embedded within a hostile environment. And at the center of this emerging system is a strategic objective that will define its next phase. The acquisition of a fortress that will allow this vision to become physically anchored in the world. That fortress is Alamut, and its capture will mark the transition from ideology to action, from vision to structure, from thinker to builder of a revolutionary order. In the mountains of northern Persia, where valleys cut through stone and roads vanish into elevation, power does not behave the way it does in open plains. Armies move more slowly. Governance becomes fragmented, and small positions of control can dominate vast regions simply by occupying the right geography. It is here that Hassan I-Sabbah turns theory into action. For years, he has been building a network of followers, observers, and sympathizers, not an army in the traditional sense, but a disciplined structure of individuals bound by ideology, loyalty, and secrecy. His strategy has never depended on open confrontation. Instead, it relies on precision, identifying weak points in systems of power and occupying them before those systems can respond effectively. The target he chooses is Alamut, a fortress perched high in the Alborz Mountains. Its position alone makes it significant. Surrounded by steep cliffs and narrow access routes, Alamut is naturally defensible. Whoever controls it does not need a large army to hold it. Geography becomes the first line of defense. But Hassan does not intend to take Alamut through siege warfare. He understands that traditional military assault would be inefficient and likely unsuccessful. Instead, he employs a strategy that reflects the intellectual foundations of his Ismaili training: infiltration, influence, and gradual internal control. Over time, his agents begin to integrate themselves into the surrounding region. They establish relationships, acquire trust, and slowly position themselves within the local power structure. This is not sudden rebellion, it is accumulation. Step by step, influence replaces visibility. By the time the takeover occurs, it does not resemble a conventional conquest. Historical accounts suggest that Hassan secures control of Alamut through a combination of negotiation, strategic presence, and the gradual conversion of key figures within the fortress's administration. Whether the ruling authority fully understands the extent of Hassan's influence before the transition occurs is unclear. What is clear is the outcome. Alamut changes hands, without the kind of prolonged destruction associated with siege warfare, without the collapse of a large army. Instead, control shifts through internal transformation. Once Hassan establishes authority, he does something more important than simply occupying the fortress. He transforms it. Alamut is no longer just a defensive position. It becomes the center of a new political and ideological system. From this moment, the Nizari Ismaili state begins to take physical form. But it is unlike traditional states of the medieval world. There are no vast territorial borders in the conventional sense. No sprawling administrative capitals. Instead, there is a network of fortified positions, mountain strongholds connected through communication, loyalty, and shared ideology. Alamut is the heart of this system, and Hassan is its architect. Inside the fortress, life is structured with precision. Discipline is not optional, it is foundational. Every aspect of existence is shaped by the need to maintain security, cohesion, and ideological alignment. Training is rigorous. Education is constant. And loyalty to the Imam becomes the central organizing principle of identity. But perhaps the most significant transformation under Hassan's leadership is psychological. Because the state he builds does not rely solely on physical defense. It relies on belief. The conviction that the Imam represents not just political authority, but access to deeper truth. In this system, obedience is not framed as submission to a ruler in the conventional sense. It is framed as alignment with a higher understanding of reality itself. This creates a structure that is unusually resilient, because it is not based purely on fear or coercion. It is based on conviction. At the same time, the surrounding political environment remains unstable. The Seljuk Empire dominates much of Persia and surrounding regions. It is a Sunni political structure with significant military strength and administrative reach. From its perspective, the emergence of a fortified Ismaili presence in the mountains represents both a political and ideological challenge. Tension begins to rise, but direct confrontation is difficult. Alamat's geography makes it resistant to conventional military campaigns. Any attempt at siege warfare would require significant resources and extended time, with no guarantee of success. This creates a strategic deadlock. The Seljuks cannot easily eliminate Alamat, and Alamat, under Hassan's leadership, does not attempt territorial expansion in the traditional sense. Instead, the system evolves in a different direction, one that prioritizes targeted influence over territorial control. This is where the structure begins to take on a form that will later be widely misunderstood. Because what emerges from Alamat is not simply a fortress state. It is a network of strategic intervention, a system designed to operate within existing political structures rather than replace them outright. And as this system develops, it begins to acquire a reputation beyond its actual scale. Stories spread, rumors circulate, and external observers begin to construct narratives about the group that are shaped as much by fear and interpretation as by direct knowledge. But at this stage, Hassan's focus remains internal. Consolidation, training, structure, and ideological stability. He understands that survival in a hostile environment depends not only on resisting external pressure, but on maintaining internal cohesion over time. Alamat becomes a laboratory of governance under constraint, a place where ideology is not abstract but operational. And from this foundation, a new phase begins to emerge, one in which the system is no longer defined only by survival, but by interaction with the wider political world, a phase where influence extends beyond the mountains, and where the actions of this hidden state begin to intersect with the broader conflicts of the region, including the rising tensions between Islamic powers and the arrival of external forces from the West. The stage is now set for a new kind of conflict, one not defined by open armies alone, but by strategy, perception, and targeted action. And this is where the world first begins to hear whispers of something new. A name, a structure, a hidden order operating beyond conventional warfare. By the time Alamat is firmly established under Hassan I Sabbah's control, the nature of the Nizari Ismaili movement begins to change in a fundamental way. It is no longer just a fortified refuge in the mountains. It is no longer just a political statement of survival. It becomes something more structured, more deliberate, more systematized. It becomes an order. Within Alamat, Hassan understands that geography alone is not enough to sustain long-term resistance against larger empires like the Seljuks. Mountains can protect a fortress, but they cannot protect an idea unless that idea is disciplined, transmitted, and preserved across generations. So the focus shifts inward, toward people, toward structure, toward control of cohesion rather than territory. The individuals who enter the system are not simply soldiers in the traditional sense. They are part of a carefully constructed hierarchy of training, evaluation, and ideological reinforcement. Every stage of their development is designed to eliminate uncertainty and reinforce absolute alignment with the central doctrine, loyalty to the Imam, and by extension, loyalty to the structure that represents him. But this loyalty is not framed as blind obedience in a simple political sense. Within the Ismaili worldview, the Imam is not merely a ruler. He is the interpreter of hidden truth. the guide who understands the deeper layers of reality that are not visible to ordinary perception. And so obedience becomes something more than submission. It becomes alignment with truth itself. This distinction is critical because it transforms what would otherwise be a political organization into something closer to a spiritual intellectual system with operational consequences. Inside a Lammut, education is central. Recruits are not only trained in physical discipline and strategic thinking. They are also immersed in theological interpretation, philosophical reasoning, and symbolic understanding of reality. The world is presented as layered. What is visible on the surface is only the outer shell of a deeper structure that can only be understood through proper guidance. This framework produces a highly unified internal identity. Individuals do not see themselves as isolated actors. They see themselves as part of a larger mission that extends beyond immediate political reality. And this is where Hassan's system begins to diverge from conventional states. Most medieval powers rely on territorial expansion, taxation, and military control of populations. The system at a Lammut relies on something different. Selective placement, strategic presence, and the ability to influence key points within larger political structures without requiring direct governance of those structures. In practical terms, this means that the order does not need to control cities or regions outright. It needs access to decision-makers, access to strategic environments, access to pressure points within rival systems. This creates a form of power that is difficult for larger empires to counter directly, because it does not behave like a conventional enemy. It does not always present itself as a standing army. It does not always occupy territory. Instead, it operates through precision and unpredictability. As this system develops, its reputation begins to spread beyond its immediate environment. Not through official records or structured accounts, but through fragmented reports, rumors, and the interpretations of those who encounter its influence indirectly. In a world where communication is slow and political intelligence is often incomplete, perception becomes reality. And perception of the Nizari Ismaili order begins to take on a life of its own. External observers, particularly those aligned with rival powers such as the Seljuks, begin to construct narratives about the group that emphasize secrecy and absolute loyalty. Because from the outside, a system that operates without clear visibility appears mysterious. And what is not fully understood is often interpreted through fear. But internally, the system is far more structured than its reputation suggests. Hassan maintains strict organizational discipline. Roles are clearly defined. Communication is controlled. And loyalty is continuously reinforced through ideological education rather than emotional manipulation alone. The goal is not chaos. It is precision under constraint. Every action is framed within a larger logic of survival in a hostile political environment. At the same time, the external world is not static. The Seljuk Empire continues to govern large regions of Persia and surrounding territories. While powerful, it is also internally complex, with competing factions, court politics, and regional instability. This creates opportunities, not necessarily for direct confrontation, but for targeted intervention. And over time, the Nizari system begins to engage with this environment in ways that extend beyond a Lammut itself. Certain actions attributed to the order begin to focus on key individuals within political structures. Not mass conflict, not territorial warfare, but precise disruption. These actions, whether fully coordinated from a Lammut or carried out by aligned agents in the field, contribute to the growing reputation of the group as a force capable of influencing political outcomes far beyond its physical size. This is where history and perception begin to diverge more sharply. Because external accounts often emphasize the dramatic and symbolic aspects of these events, while internal reality is more structured, more strategic, and more constrained by necessity. But regardless of interpretation, the effect is the same. The order becomes known, not as a conventional state, but as something operating within the gaps between states, between empires, between visibility and secrecy. At the center of it all remains Hassan-i-Sabbah, a figure who does not govern through expansion, but through structure, through discipline, and through the careful maintenance of an ideological system designed to survive in conditions where open confrontation would be unsustainable. And as this system matures, it begins to move toward a new phase of its existence, one in which external pressure increases, political tensions escalate, and the wider Islamic world begins to respond more directly to the presence of this hidden network in the mountains. A response that will eventually bring the system into direct conflict with the most powerful military force of its time. As the Nizari Ismaili order expands its influence through precision, secrecy, and strategic presence, something begins to happen that Hassan-i-Sabbah never fully controls. The world outside Alamut begins to interpret it. And interpretation, once it escapes direct control, rarely stays accurate. In the medieval Islamic world, information does not travel through centralized systems. It moves through merchants, soldiers, travelers, court officials, and oral accounts that change slightly with every retelling. By the time a story reaches a distant city, it is no longer a record of events. It is a reconstruction shaped by fear, imagination, and political bias. This is the environment in which the reputation of the order begins to transform. What is, internally, a disciplined and highly structured ideological system operating under extreme political pressure becomes, externally, something far more ambiguous, something hidden, something feared, and eventually something mythologized. The first layer of distortion comes from language itself. The term that will later become assassin does not originally describe the group as they understand themselves. Early references, likely derived from words associated with Ismaili communities and their critics, begin to circulate in hostile political environments. Over time, these terms become simplified, exaggerated, and detached from their original meaning. But language alone is not responsible for the transformation. Politics plays a far larger role. The Seljuk Empire and other rival powers have strong incentives to portray the Nizari Ismaili order not as a rational political ideological system, but as a hidden and dangerous force operating outside conventional norms of warfare. Because something that cannot be easily understood is easier to frame as threatening, and something framed as threatening becomes easier to justify opposing. So reports begin to circulate describing the order in increasingly dramatic terms. Stories emphasize absolute obedience, secret training, hidden strongholds, and acts of precise political violence that appear from the outside to emerge without warning. But in the process of retelling, context is stripped away. Motivation becomes simplified, and complexity is replaced with narrative clarity. The most influential distortions emerge later through external travelers and chroniclers, including figures such as Marco Polo, whose accounts, written long after the events and far removed from the actual environment, blend observation with hearsay and imagination. In these accounts, the order becomes associated with the idea of manipulation, secrecy, and controlled indoctrination in isolated environments. Although historically unreliable in many details, these narratives play a major role in shaping how later generations understand the group. Because myth does not require accuracy to be powerful. It requires repetition. And once repeated often enough, perception becomes reality in the cultural imagination. Within the actual structure of Alamut, however, the system remains consistent with its foundational principles. Loyalty to the Imam, discipline under constraint, strategic adaptation to hostile environments, and selective engagement with political structures when necessary for survival or influence. But outside observers do not see this internal complexity. They see only the outcomes that reach them through fragmented reports. And those outcomes, stripped of context, appear intentional, coordinated, and mysterious. This gap between internal reality and external perception becomes one of the defining features of the Order's historical legacy. Because the less visible a system is, the more room there is for interpretation. And in a world already shaped by political conflict, religious division, and competing empires, interpretation often leans toward fear. As the Seljuk political environment continues to experience instability, and as regional conflicts persist, references to the Nizari Ismaili order increasingly take on symbolic weight. They are no longer just a faction within a larger religious and political landscape. They become, in external narratives, a representation of hidden influence, of unseen power operating beneath the surface of visible political structures. This transformation is gradual but persistent, and it begins to detach the Order's identity from its actual scale. What is, in reality, a relatively small but highly organized network operating from fortified positions, is increasingly described as something far larger in psychological and narrative terms. A shadow presence, a hidden force within the political fabric of the region. At the same time, Alamut itself continues to function as a center of training, governance, and ideological continuity. Hassanai Saba maintains strict internal discipline. The system he builds is not chaotic or uncontrolled. It is structured with precision, designed to ensure survival under conditions where open warfare would be disadvantageous. Every element of the Order is shaped by necessity. Secrecy is not aesthetic. It is functional. Discipline is not symbolic. It is structural. And loyalty is not emotional alone. It is foundational to the system's existence. But even the most structured systems cannot fully control how they are perceived from the outside. And as time progresses, the reputation of the Order continues to evolve independently of its internal reality. Stories become more elaborate. Descriptions become more symbolic. And the boundary between history and interpretation begins to blur. What began as a localized political-ideological movement in the mountains of Persia is now increasingly understood, outside its own framework, as something far more enigmatic. A presence that seems to operate within political systems without fully belonging to them. A force that appears in narratives not as an army, but as an idea. And this idea, once established in cultural memory, becomes difficult to reverse. Because from this point forward, the Order is no longer defined solely by what it is. It is also defined by what others believe it to be. And that belief will shape the next phase of its existence. As external powers begin to respond more directly to its presence. And as the political landscape of the region shifts toward a confrontation that will test the limits of Alamut's structure. As the reputation of the Nizari Ismaili order spreads beyond the mountains of Alamut, it inevitably draws the attention of the dominant political force in the region, the Seljuk Empire. At its height, the Seljuk state is one of the most powerful Sunni political structures in the medieval Islamic world. It governs vast territories stretching across Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. Its authority is enforced through a combination of military strength, administrative systems, and alliances with religious institutions that reinforce its legitimacy. But empires are not only defined by what they control. They are also defined by what they cannot easily eliminate. And in the highlands of northern Persia, the Seljuks face precisely this problem. The Nizari Ismaili presence in Alamat is not a conventional territorial rival. It does not occupy open plains or major cities in a way that allows direct confrontation on equal terms. Instead, it exists in a fragmented network of fortified positions embedded within difficult terrain. This creates a strategic challenge. Because traditional imperial warfare is designed for visibility, armies move, supply lines are established, and battles are fought over defined territories. But the system centered around Alamat does not always present itself in ways that can be engaged directly. It operates through select locations, through internal cohesion, and through carefully controlled engagement with the surrounding political environment. As a result, the Seljuk response does not take the form of a single decisive campaign. Instead, it becomes a prolonged period of pressure. Administrative surveillance increases. Regional governors are instructed to monitor suspected sympathizers. Military expeditions are occasionally launched into mountainous regions, though these efforts often struggle against terrain and logistical limitations. But more importantly, the conflict becomes psychological. Because the Seljuk leadership is not only reacting to physical threats, it is responding to uncertainty. And uncertainty in governance often produces exaggerated perceptions of danger. Within Seljuk political discourse, the Nizari Ismaili order begins to be framed less as a localized ideological movement and more as a destabilizing presence within the broader system of authority. This framing is important because it justifies continued pressure. And pressure, in turn, reinforces the cycle of secrecy and defensive adaptation within Alamat. What emerges is not a direct war in the conventional sense, but a sustained condition of hostility, a state of mutual awareness between a vast empire and a small, highly organized mountain network. In this environment, individual actors within the Seljuk administration become key points of vulnerability. Viziers, governors, and regional officials carry significant influence over the functioning of the empire. Their decisions affect taxation, military deployment, and political stability across entire regions. This concentration of authority creates structural sensitivity. And in systems of high centralization, even small disruptions at key points can have disproportionate effects. Within historical accounts, filtered through varying degrees of reliability and interpretation, certain targeted actions attributed to agents associated with the Nizari Ismaili network begin to appear in the record. These actions are not random. They are consistently described as highly selective, aimed at individuals occupying significant political positions within hostile administrations. But it is important to understand how these accounts function in historical memory. They are often shaped by external observers who lack full visibility into internal motivations, planning structures, or operational constraints. As a result, interpretation and reality begin to diverge further. To Seljuk authorities and their allies, these events reinforce the perception of a hidden and highly organized threat embedded within the political landscape. To others, they appear as symptoms of a broader struggle over legitimacy, authority, and control in a fragmented region. And within Alamat itself, they are understood through a different lens entirely, one shaped by ideological commitment, survival strategy, and the logic of operating within hostile environments. These competing perspectives do not converge. Instead, they coexist. And in that coexistence, myth continues to expand. Because when a system is seen differently from multiple vantage points, each incomplete, the gaps between interpretations are filled by narrative construction. Over time, the Nizari Ismaili order becomes associated not just with specific actions, but with the idea of precision itself. With calculated intervention, with hidden structure operating beneath visible political systems. This perception is reinforced by the order's continued emphasis on secrecy and internal discipline. Alamat remains a closed system, accessible only through carefully controlled pathways of initiation and trust. Information flows inward and outward in regulated channels, ensuring that internal cohesion is maintained even under external pressure. But this same structure also contributes to external misunderstanding. Because systems that limit visibility often generate speculation. And speculation, when repeated, becomes cultural memory. As the Seljuk Empire continues to face internal challenges, ranging from administrative fragmentation to succession disputes, its ability to fully address the Nizari presence becomes increasingly limited. This does not mean the conflict disappears. It means it stabilizes into a long-term condition of tension. Neither side achieving complete resolution. Neither side fully eliminating the other's influence. Instead, a new equilibrium forms. One defined not by open war, but by sustained pressure and selective engagement. In this environment, Hassanai Saba's system achieves something unusual for its time. It survives not by dominating territory, but by maintaining continuity under constraint. And as decades pass, this model becomes increasingly difficult for external powers to dismantle. Because it does not rely on traditional structures that can be easily targeted or destroyed. It relies on dispersed resilience, on ideological cohesion, and on the ability to adapt to shifting political conditions without losing internal identity. This is the point at which the Nizari Ismaili order transitions from being a regional anomaly into a lasting historical presence. Not because it expands into empire, but because it endures as a system operating outside conventional imperial logic. And as it endures, its reputation continues to evolve beyond its original context, setting the stage for encounters with even greater external forces in the centuries ahead. Within the walls of Alamat, the outside world feels distant, not only geographically, but structurally. The fortress is not simply a military position carved into the mountains of northern Persia. It is an enclosed system of governance, education, and ideological reinforcement designed to function under constant external pressure. Everything inside is intentional. Nothing is left to chance. Life begins with discipline. The rhythm of the fortress is shaped by routine, observation, and structured instruction. Individuals entering the system are not treated as isolated participants in a military organization. They are immersed in a layered environment where learning, loyalty, and identity formation are deeply interconnected. At the core of this structure is the principle that reality is not limited to what is immediately visible. Instead, existence is understood as layered. The physical world is only the surface. Beneath it lies meaning. And beneath meaning lies truth, accessible only through guided interpretation. This worldview is not abstract philosophy in Alamat, it is operational doctrine. It shapes how individuals are trained, how decisions are made, and how loyalty is defined. Because within this system, loyalty is not simply obedience to authority in a political sense. It is alignment with perceived truth as interpreted through the Imam's guidance. This distinction is essential to understanding how the order maintains cohesion. Authority is not framed as arbitrary power. It is framed as access to knowledge that others cannot see. Education within Alamat reflects this structure. Training is not limited to physical discipline or military preparation. It includes theological study, philosophical reasoning, and symbolic interpretation of texts and ideas. Recruits are taught to analyze not only what is said, but what is meant, not only what appears, but what lies beneath appearance. This creates a mental framework where perception itself becomes a subject of training. In such a system, certainty is not assumed. It is constructed, and constructed certainty becomes one of the strongest binding forces within the organization. At the same time, Alamat operates under constant external pressure. The Seljuk political environment remains unstable but dominant, and surrounding regions are shaped by shifting alliances, competing authorities, and intermittent military threats. This external instability reinforces internal cohesion. Because when the outside world is unpredictable, internal structure becomes more important. And within Alamat, structure is everything. Roles are clearly defined. Communication is controlled. Information flows through regulated channels. And trust is not assumed. It is earned through sustained demonstration of loyalty and alignment with the system's principles. This creates a tightly integrated internal environment where fragmentation is minimized. But it also creates isolation from the outside world. And isolation has consequences. As time passes, those outside Alamat begin to construct their own understanding of what exists within it. But they do so without access to its internal logic. They see only effects, not structure. And in the absence of structure, interpretation fills the gap. This is where myth begins to deepen further. Because systems that are not fully visible are often reconstructed in the imagination of those who observe them from a distance. In surrounding political environments, Alamat becomes associated with secrecy not only as a necessity, but as a defining characteristic. But internally, secrecy is not symbolic. It is practical. It ensures survival in a hostile geopolitical environment where open identification could lead to immediate destruction. The fortress itself reflects this logic. Its position in the mountains provides natural defense, but its internal organization ensures that even if external forces were to approach, resistance would not depend solely on geography. It would depend on structure. And structure in this system is deeply embedded in the minds of its participants. Over time, Alamat becomes more than a physical stronghold. It becomes a controlled environment of perception, a place where identity is shaped through continuous reinforcement of ideological principles and disciplined interaction with information. This does not mean the system is static. It evolves in response to external pressures, but its evolution is guided by consistency rather than expansion, adaptation rather than conquest, survival rather than domination. Within this framework, Hassanai Saba remains a central figure, not as a ruler in the conventional sense of imperial governance, but as an architect of structure. His role is less about direct administration of daily affairs and more about maintaining the coherence of the system as a whole, ensuring that ideological alignment remains intact, ensuring that internal fragmentation does not occur, and ensuring that the system continues to function under external stress. As years pass, Alamat's reputation outside its walls continues to diverge from its internal reality. The gap between perception and structure grows wider. And within that gap, narratives expand. Stories circulate that emphasize mystery, control, and hidden influence. But within Alamut itself, the focus remains unchanged. Discipline, cohesion, survival, and the maintenance of a system that must function without the advantages of conventional state power. This balance between internal order and external perception defines this stage of the Order's existence. It is neither expansionist nor purely defensive. It is adaptive. And as the political landscape of the wider region continues to shift, this adaptive structure prepares to encounter new forces that will test its limits in ways previously unseen. For beyond the Seljuk framework, larger transformations are already beginning to emerge in the surrounding world. Transformations that will eventually bring the Order into contact with powers far greater in scale and movement than anything it has faced so far. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, the political landscape surrounding the Nizari Ismaili Order shifts once again, but this time the change does not come only from within the Islamic world. A new force enters the region from the west. The Crusades. What begins in Europe as a series of religiously framed military campaigns quickly transforms into a long-term geopolitical presence in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant. Armies from Western Europe arrive in waves, establishing fortified states, carving out territories, and embedding themselves into an already complex regional system. For the Islamic world, this introduces a new layer of instability. For the Nizari Ismaili Order, it introduces something more complicated. A second axis of power. The world is no longer defined only by internal Islamic political fragmentation between Sunni and Shia dynasties. It is now shaped by the intersection of three overlapping systems: the Abbasid symbolic caliphate, regional powers like the Seljuks, and the newly established Crusader states along the Mediterranean frontier. In this environment, survival requires flexibility. And flexibility becomes a defining characteristic of political actors operating in the region. The Nizari Ismaili presence, centered in the mountains of Persia, but extending through a wider network of influence, now exists within a world where enemies are not uniform and alliances are not fixed. Crusader states such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and others establish themselves through military conquest and fortification. Their presence introduces new diplomatic and military dynamics into the region, forcing existing powers to adapt rapidly. What emerges is not a simple binary conflict between East and West. It is a layered system of shifting relationships. And within that system, the Nizari Ismaili Order operates not as a dominant empire, but as a strategic actor navigating between larger forces. This is where historical accounts begin to describe interactions that are often misunderstood when viewed through simplified narratives. There are recorded instances of contact between Nizari agents and Crusader leaders, as well as engagements involving rival Muslim powers. These interactions are not easily categorized as alliances or enmities in a fixed sense. Instead, they reflect a pragmatic reality of the time. Political survival often requires temporary alignment, negotiation, or avoidance of direct confrontation, depending on circumstances. The Crusader presence, in particular, introduces a new dimension to regional politics. Because unlike earlier internal Islamic divisions, this external force does not share the same ideological framework. It is shaped by different religious, linguistic, and political structures. This makes interactions more complex, and it also makes misunderstandings more likely. Within European accounts, reports of the Nizari Ismaili Order begin to circulate more widely. These accounts, often filtered through the Crusader experience in the Levant, describe a group operating with extreme secrecy and precision in a politically fragmented environment. However, these descriptions are often incomplete. They emphasize mystery more than structure. They emphasize action more than context. And over time, they contribute to a growing European perception of the order as something fundamentally enigmatic, a hidden force within the Islamic world. At the same time, within the Islamic sphere, the order continues to navigate pressure from regional Sunni powers, particularly remnants of Seljuk authority and emerging successor states. The environment remains unstable, and direct confrontation is often avoided in favor of selective engagement. In this overlapping geopolitical space, the Nizari system continues to function through its established principles: controlled presence, ideological cohesion, and strategic adaptation. But the complexity of the environment increases significantly, because now the order is not only responding to one dominant political structure. It is operating within multiple intersecting systems of power. This increases both opportunity and risk. Opportunity because rival powers are often in conflict with one another. Risk because instability creates unpredictable consequences. In this period, historical sources describe several politically significant incidents involving key figures in regional governance. These events are often interpreted externally as evidence of the order's capacity for precise intervention in political structures. But internally, the logic remains consistent with earlier principles. These are not actions of expansion. They are actions within a constrained system of survival, influence, and strategic positioning in a hostile environment. However, perception once again diverges from internal reality. And in the case of the Crusades, that divergence becomes even more pronounced due to cultural distance. European chroniclers, unfamiliar with the internal ideological structure of Ismaili thought, interpret what they observe through their own conceptual frameworks. This leads to narratives that emphasize secrecy, loyalty structures, and isolated mountain strongholds in ways that often strip away the internal philosophical context. As a result, the Nizari Ismaili order begins to take on an increasingly symbolic identity in Western imagination. Not simply as a political group, but as an archetype of hidden influence, a representation of concealed power operating beneath visible structures of authority. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the order continues to exist as one actor among many in a fragmented and competitive political environment. Its survival depends not on dominance, but on adaptability, not on expansion, but on maintaining continuity under pressure. And as the Crusades continue, and as regional powers continue to shift and reorganize, the system centered around Alamut begins to move toward another major transformation. Because even as external pressures remain significant, a new force is beginning to rise in the broader region. One that will not only challenge existing powers, but reshape the entire political order of the Middle East. A force that will test every system it encounters, including the hidden mountain network that has thus far survived through precision and structure. The Mongols are coming, and unlike previous powers, they will not be constrained by the same limits of terrain, fragmentation, or political hesitation. Their arrival will mark a fundamentally different kind of challenge, one that will push the Nizari Ismaili system to its breaking point. In the early 13th century, the balance of power across Asia begins to shift in a way no regional system can fully anticipate. It does not arrive as a gradual change in political influence. It arrives as momentum. Expanding from the eastern steppes of Central Asia, the Mongol Empire emerges under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors as a force defined by mobility, discipline, and overwhelming military coordination. Unlike the fragmented political structures of Persia, the Levant, and the Islamic heartlands, The Mongol system is unified under a centralized command structure that prioritizes speed and total effectiveness in conquest. For the Nizari Ismaili order, this represents a fundamentally different kind of threat. Previous adversaries, Seljuk remnants, regional dynasties, Crusader states, operated within systems constrained by geography, politics, and internal fragmentation. Even when powerful, they were limited by logistical dependencies and territorial governance structures. The Mongols are not constrained in the same way. Their armies move rapidly across vast distances, adapting to terrain with exceptional efficiency. Communication systems allow coordination over long ranges. Psychological warfare is used alongside direct military engagement. Resistance is not simply defeated, it is dismantled. As Mongol expansion moves westward into Persia, the political environment surrounding Alamut changes rapidly. Fortresses that once relied on geography as their primary defense begin to face a new reality. The assumption that mountain positions can indefinitely resist external forces no longer holds in the same way it once did. The Nizari Ismaili system, which has survived through centuries of selective engagement, ideological cohesion, and strategic adaptation, now encounters an adversary that does not operate within the same framework of political negotiation or limited warfare. The Mongols do not seek equilibrium. They seek submission or destruction. As Mongol forces enter the broader Persian region, regional powers begin to collapse in rapid succession. Cities fall not after prolonged political absorption, but through direct and often overwhelming military campaigns. Administrative structures disintegrate under pressure. Local rulers are either eliminated or forced into immediate compliance. In this environment, Alamut stands as one of several fortified positions still maintaining its internal structure. But its strategic situation is no longer stable. The system built by Hassanai Sabbah was designed for survival under fragmented political conditions, where opposing forces were numerous, localized, and often unable to coordinate effectively against a hidden network operating in mountainous terrain. The Mongols remove that fragmentation. They replace it with unified pressure. And that changes everything. Historical accounts describe a period in which Mongol attention turns toward the fortified Nizari positions in Persia. Whether through direct confrontation or systematic campaign, the result is consistent across sources. Sustained military pressure is applied to dismantle isolated strongholds. Alamut, despite its defensive advantages, is no longer operating in a world where geography alone guarantees survival. Its isolation, once an advantage, becomes a limitation. Because isolation prevents reinforcement, prevents coordination with external allies, and increases vulnerability under sustained siege conditions. As Mongol forces advance, the Nizari leadership faces a structural reality that cannot be resolved through ideological cohesion alone. The system that has sustained the order for generations is now being tested at its most fundamental level, its ability to physically endure overwhelming external force. Unlike earlier conflicts with the Seljuks or regional powers, there is no prolonged equilibrium phase, no extended stalemate. The Mongol strategy is not designed for balance. It is designed for resolution. And that resolution typically takes the form of elimination of resistance structures. Within this context, the fate of Alamut becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Eventually, Mongol forces reach the fortress system that has defined the Nizari Ismaili presence for generations. What follows is not merely a military event, but a structural collapse of an entire operational model. Fortresses that once functioned as nodes of a decentralized survival system are systematically dismantled. Administrative records, physical infrastructure, and defensive capabilities are destroyed or rendered unusable. Alamat itself, the symbolic and operational center of the system, falls during this broader campaign. The loss is not simply territorial. It is systemic. Because Alamat was not just a stronghold. It was the organizing center of a distributed ideological and strategic network. Its destruction represents the collapse of that centralized anchor. However, what distinguishes the Nizari Ismaili order from many other political entities destroyed during Mongol expansion is not its fall, but what follows it. The system does not vanish entirely. It transforms. Survival, in this context, does not depend on maintaining territorial control. It depends on preserving continuity under radically altered conditions. As the physical structure of Alamat is destroyed, surviving members of the broader Nizari network disperse. Leadership transitions into a phase of concealment and relocation. The visible political structure that once operated from fortified mountain positions is no longer viable in its previous form. But ideological continuity remains. The belief system, the interpretive framework, and the internal structures of authority do not disappear with the loss of territory. Instead, they adapt. They move into new forms of organization that are less visible, more dispersed, and more integrated into surrounding societies. In this way, the Mongol destruction of Alamat does not represent the end of the Nizari Ismaili tradition. It represents its transformation from a geographically anchored system into a more dispersed and adaptive structure of continuity. The external world perceives this moment as the collapse of the assassins of Alamat. But internally, it is understood as a transition. From fortress-based survival to concealed continuity. From centralized stronghold to distributed presence. From visible structure to adaptive existence within new political conditions. And as Mongol power continues to reshape the broader region, the remnants of the system that once centered on Alamat begin to enter a new phase of history. One that is less defined by direct confrontation with empires, and more defined by survival within their changing frameworks. When the Mongol storm passes through Persia, it does not simply destroy cities and fortresses. It dismantles entire systems of political imagination. For centuries, power in the region had been defined through a familiar logic: fortified cities, dynastic rule, religious legitimacy, and contested territorial control between competing empires. Even the Nizari Ismaili order, despite its secrecy and decentralization, had still operated within a recognizable framework anchored by Alamat as its symbolic and strategic center. That framework no longer exists. With the fall of Alamat and the collapse of its surrounding fortress network, the visible structure that once defined the Nizari Ismaili presence in Persia is effectively removed from the map. But history rarely ends cleanly. What disappears in one form often re-emerges in another. In the aftermath of Mongol expansion, the surviving elements of the Nizari community are forced into a radically different condition. There is no central fortress to organize around, no unified territorial base, no stable political environment in which to operate openly. What remains is continuity without visibility. Leadership does not vanish, but it is no longer expressed through fixed geographic centers. Instead, it shifts into more flexible and adaptive forms. Authority becomes less tied to physical structures and more tied to lineage, interpretation, and internal recognition within dispersed communities. In this transformation, the concept of the Imam becomes even more central. Because without a fortress state to anchor identity, ideological cohesion becomes the primary form of continuity. The Imam is no longer associated with a visible political system in the way Alamat once represented. Instead, the Imam becomes the symbolic and spiritual axis around which fragmented communities orient themselves. This shift is not immediate or uniform. It develops gradually across regions, shaped by local conditions, survival pressures, and varying degrees of external tolerance or hostility. Some communities integrate quietly into surrounding societies, preserving their identity through discrete practice and internal transmission of belief. Others maintain stronger internal boundaries, carefully protecting their traditions through controlled networks of communication. What unites them is not geography. It is continuity of interpretation. And that continuity is maintained under conditions of concealment. From the perspective of surrounding powers, particularly those who inherit or emerge from Mongol-dominated territories, the once visible Nizari presence appears to have diminished significantly. The fortress system is gone. The centralized structure has collapsed. And the political threat it once represented is no longer present in the same form. But this perception is incomplete, because what has disappeared is not the tradition itself, but its visibility as a concentrated political force. What remains is distributed across regions, embedded within broader social environments, and sustained through lineage-based and community-based structures that do not rely on territorial sovereignty. This is a critical turning point in the history of the movement. It marks the transition from a state-centered system to a diasporic network of continuity. In earlier phases, survival depended on control of strategic geography. Now, survival depends on adaptability within existing political frameworks. This change fundamentally alters the relationship between the Nizari tradition and surrounding powers. No longer a fortified mountain presence that can be isolated or besieged, it becomes a more fluid and less visible component of the broader Islamic world. Over time, this transformation leads to further evolution in identity and structure. Different branches of the community adapt in different ways, influenced by regional politics, cultural integration, and shifting historical conditions. But the central thread remains intact, a continuous line of spiritual authority understood through the concept of the Imam, preserved through internal recognition and communal continuity. Meanwhile, the broader Islamic world continues to evolve in response to Mongol impact and subsequent political restructuring. New dynasties rise in the vacuum left by collapsed systems, trade routes are re-established, cities rebuild, and over time, the region gradually stabilizes into new configurations of power. In this reconstructed world, the memory of Alamut and the Nizari Ismaili order begins to take on a more symbolic form. It is no longer a present political force in the way it once was. Instead, it becomes part of historical memory, filtered through chronicles, interpretations, and increasingly distant recollections. And as that memory spreads beyond the region, particularly into later European accounts, it becomes further reshaped by translation, misunderstanding, and cultural reinterpretation. This is where the transformation from history into legend accelerates. What was once a specific political ideological system becomes, in later retellings, something more abstract. A hidden order, a secret lineage of influence, a narrative of concealed power operating beneath visible structures of authority. But within the communities that trace continuity back to the original Nizari tradition, the story is not one of disappearance. It is one of adaptation. The fortress is gone. The political state is gone. But the line of continuity remains. And that continuity will eventually re-emerge in new historical contexts, under new names, and within new political realities. Not as a fortress in the mountains of Persia, but as a living tradition that has survived through transformation rather than extinction. And it is from this long arc of survival, stretching from hidden mountain strongholds to dispersed communities, that the final phase of the story begins to take shape. A phase defined not by warfare or collapse, but by memory, interpretation, and the enduring legacy of what the world came to call the Assassins. When empires fall, what survives is often not their structure, but their story. And few medieval groups demonstrate this more clearly than the Nizari Ismaili Order of Alamat, later remembered across centuries under the name that outsiders gave them, the Assassins. By the time direct political memory of Alamat fades, the historical reality of the Nizari system has already begun to separate from its later reputation. What was once a highly structured, ideologically driven network operating under extreme geopolitical pressure gradually transforms in the historical imagination into something far more symbolic. A hidden order, a secret society, a shadow force operating behind the surface of empires. This transformation does not happen in a single moment. It develops over time, shaped by distance, misunderstanding, and the way fragmented information is preserved across cultures. In the Islamic world, chroniclers and historians preserve accounts of the Nizari Ismaili presence, but often through the lens of political conflict, regional rivalry, and retrospective interpretation of events that were already complex in their own time. The destruction of Alamat under Mongol expansion reinforces the sense of finality in some accounts, while others preserve memory of continued Nizari continuity through dispersed communities and surviving lines of leadership. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, but neither captures the full internal experience of the tradition as it evolved. Because internally, the collapse of Alamat was not understood as extinction. It was understood as transformation under necessity. But as centuries pass, external memory becomes increasingly detached from internal continuity. In Europe, especially during and after the Crusader period, fragmented reports, travel accounts, and translated texts begin to circulate. These sources often combine observation, rumor, and imaginative reconstruction. Over time, they contribute to a growing Western fascination with the idea of a secretive Eastern order operating through concealed networks and precise interventions in political affairs. The word assassin, derived through linguistic distortion and reinterpretation, becomes fixed in European languages. Detached from its original context, it takes on a life of its own. In popular imagination, the group becomes associated not with its actual theological foundations or historical complexity, but with a simplified archetype, a hidden organization exercising influence through secrecy and targeted action. This archetype persists far beyond the medieval period. In literature, the assassins are repeatedly reimagined, reshaped, and reinterpreted according to the cultural anxieties of each era. Renaissance writers, Enlightenment thinkers, and modern authors each project their own frameworks onto the historical fragments that survived. In the modern era, this process intensifies further. The image of the assassins becomes embedded in global popular culture, appearing in novels, films, and especially video games, where the term is often used to represent a broader concept of hidden resistance, covert action, or ideological struggle against authority. Yet beneath these reinterpretations, the historical reality remains more grounded and more complex. The Nizari Ismaili tradition is not defined solely by secrecy or violence, but by survival under shifting and often hostile political conditions, and by a continuous intellectual and spiritual framework centered on the concept of the Imam. What began in the fractured political landscape following early Islamic succession debates evolved through Fatimid intellectual culture, Persian revolutionary adaptation under Hassan-I Sabbah, and the structured system of Alamat, before transitioning into a dispersed network of communities that preserved identity without territorial sovereignty. It is a history defined not by a single moment of rise or fall, but by adaptation across centuries. Meanwhile, the modern descendants of this tradition exist in a radically different context. No longer operating as a fortified political military system, they are part of a global religious community shaped by migration, education, and contemporary institutional development. Their identity is no longer defined by fortress strongholds or political confrontation, but by continuity of belief, interpretation, and community structure in a globalized world. And yet, the shadow of history remains. The name Assassins, though historically distorted, continues to circulate as a symbol in global culture, detached from its origins, yet still shaped by them in indirect ways. This is the final paradox of Alamut. A system designed for survival through invisibility ultimately becomes one of the most visible myths in world history. A historical reality transformed into cultural archetype. A political ideological network reinterpreted as legend. And a fortress state that no longer exists physically, but continues to exist in memory, imagination, and storytelling across centuries. In the end, the story of the Assassins is not only about power, secrecy, or political violence. It is about how history is remembered when direct understanding fades, how complex systems are simplified over time, and how survival, whether physical, ideological, or cultural, can produce narratives that outlast the structures that created them. From the mountains of Alamut to the pages of global history, the legacy of the Nizari Ismaili order endures not as a single truth, but as a layered convergence of reality and interpretation. A reminder that what history preserves is not only what happened, but what people believed happened. And in that space between fact and perception, the Assassins continue to live on. Not as a fortress, not as an army, but as a story that refuses to disappear. Word count ~3 280. Final ending line. Like and subscribe and comment what topics you would like to see next.